Really always a wonderful pleasure and a real special moment to introduce our presenter today, Michele Shover. She has such an outstanding story to tell about her own time here in Chico, and as a professor at Chico State there for decades, I believe arriving here in Chico about 1968. And again, along the way, she became that, I'll try to tone that little screech down. She became interested in Chico's story of its own history and its own past there in researching her own house that she purchased here in, I think, the 1970s. And so really it's led to a wonderful documentation of Chico's story that she's now leaving behind here. And I do want to show you that we've got a new batch of these books here. Michele's book called, whoops, upside down, Exploring Chico's Past. I'd say this is our bestseller here at the museum. And we have a hard time keeping this really on our bookshelf. It's a great compilation of Michele's essays and longer work on facets of the Chico story. So again, we do have some of these now for sale, and I am going to turn this back over to Michele Shover.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear David say there's an interest in continuing to buy this book, because this week we were getting ready to put away the summer furniture and things. I keep all the cushions in a loft. And underneath all my tax boxes were like 10 boxes of these books. And I've been reordering them and buying more. So, in any case, if the subject we're talking about today interests you, I can assure you I am just tipping the surface here. It's a very amazing topic, and it fascinated me putting it together. And I think you'd enjoy knowing more than I can actually say here. The subject of the Chinese in Chico had many aspects, but my interest in it was the anti-Chinese movement. And likewise, in doing the research for my book, Chico's Chapman, which was my goal, and which more recently came out, I waited a long time to publish that one, I discovered not only lots of new and deep information about the Chinese, and also the Indian Settler War. So each of those stopped me from the Chapman and kept me on those each for 10 or more years of going back to all the primary materials, not using the standard works. One of the problems I found in Chico history is that, with all good intention, everyone had relied on the standard histories that were published in the early 20th century and the late 19th century. And those were very whitewashed accounts, very incomplete and skewed accounts. And so I really couldn't use those. I had to go back to the documents of the time. All right, today then, my focus is on race here. We were, of course, not exceptional in this period. These problems were everywhere on the West Coast, where Chinese were so numerous. In the time that we're looking at today, Chico was a town of about 4,000 people. And in the 1860s, they began to see an increase in the number of Chinese, but it wasn't a very overwhelming number. By the 1870s, however, the Chinese who had come to build the railroads had done the job, and they had to filter out into other parts of the economy to make their livings. As Chico changed then, it became very apparent the effect of their arrival. People became accustomed to seeing Chinese companions walking down boardwalks in single file. We walk side by side, but they come from a very crowded culture, and so they walk in single file. So there were just aspects of the culture that were very exotic and interesting, and were not initially very threatening. The white community became appreciative of their noodle shop, and opium attracted a white clientele. In the early 70s, this began to magnify in terms of their influence on the town. The Chinese, by this time, they'd started laboring on farms, but by this time they were, as I've just described, in town. They were everywhere. They were cooks in restaurants. They were the wait staff. They were servants through the community in every capacity. They rented land around Chico and planted row crops. And they filled wagons of this produce, which their elders, who couldn't do the hard labor, drove through everybody's neighborhood, where the housewives and the Chinese cooks waited for their arrival to see what they would have for dinner. The Chinese produce was so high quality and so ample and cheap that John Bidwell stopped doing row crops for commercial purposes and decided to focus on other things. Women in town scrimped so that they could pass their laundry job off to Chinese who had their equipment set up along Little Chico Creek. And the Chinese did absolutely excellent work on women's clothing, which was quite elaborate in those days. In homes, women learned that Chinese were excellent house workers, and some never learned to cook. Some women never learned to cook because the Chinese did it all the time. In some places, there were families who had live-in Chinese. We all know the name Stansbury and Moorhead. Those families did have live-in help that they absolutely depended on, and the Stansburys became so, the Moorheads became so devoted to their household helper that when he got old and left to go back to China, they actually went to China and visited him. As you can see then by these examples, economics at one level or another was at the core of the relationship between whites and Chinese. The property, therefore, depended on Chinese labor because it was very capable, because it was affordable, and was more compliant than white labor. San Francisco labor contractors called the Chinese companies furnished labor up here to principally farmers. With this development, Chico's poor whites and sort of fragile middle class found themselves and their children having to compete with Chinese for very marginal labor. It became a hardship situation. The Enterprise, which was then a pro-Chinese labor newspaper, denounced what everybody observed, that it was white drunks and ne'er-do-wells lounging along the boardwalks where Chinese workers had to weave around them as they scurried to and fro from their bosses' farms, stores, and private homes. While, white youngsters took their lead from surly elders during this period. Some taunted the Chinese, others passed the time by throwing rocks at them. The Chinese clustered in their quarters, sharing rooms or houses in the old and new Chinatowns. In the mid-70s, the situation became more dire because the big depression was a very harsh depression in that decade. That reached California and reached Chico. So by the mid-70s, their vulnerability was dire. They lived at risk to armed men, a few of whom took random shots at them, and there were never prosecutions, never investigations. If the Chinese was a victim, then that was their problem. Well, it created anxiety in Chico on many levels, and the Chinese were blamed for it. They were seen as the problem. That is, if they would just leave, then Chico could be perfect. That led to the formation of a respectable anti-Chinese group that is made of business leaders and professional people. They were committed to running out the Chinese, which they wanted to do without using violence, because there was violence in the air, so they wanted to accomplish the same end, but they wanted to do it by more respectful, if you will, means. What they did was developed campaigns criticizing, humiliating the Chinese, making life uncomfortable for them here. And they criticized also white employers. So there was not only a situation of white against Chinese, there were whites against whites. So you can see that the community was, a small community of 4,000, was very much impacted on at every turn. Now, they had no effect. The Chinese needed the work they had. The laborers wanted them to work. And so another group formed. This one decided that they would be the hardcore people. They realized as they saw it, the Chinese would never leave unless they were forced to leave, unless they understood that they were morally at risk to stay. They adopted a name, they called themselves the Labor Union, which was initiated as a title by their counterparts in the Bay Area, San Francisco. They chose that name because labor unions were kind of an unrespectable name and evoked the idea of toughness. Members met in secret to plan. They burned down buildings of John Bidwell. They killed a Chinese worker on a ranch south of Chico, where they burned a large barn, killing the horses inside. They also burned down Chinese dwellings and workplaces. This receded in a brief peace in 1876 when a Red Bluff-based lumber company, Sierra Lumber, announced they were going to build a Chico planing company that would be one to prepare wood for sale, which they did along what is now called Pine Street. Some peace ensued because the president from Red Bluff said that by coming here, when they came here, when they all arrived, they would hire 200 white men. Well, economics was the core problem, and so people kind of stepped back, and it seemed to be that the problem was going to be resolved. However, the company by early '77 had arrived and was building the plant in a big place. Everybody's excited. But a train arrived from San Francisco with a car packed with Chinese workers. And those were all the basic workers for that plant. The Chico people objected. They had a big meeting downtown at 3rd and Main at the town hall. Everybody was out in the street. The building was overrun by people. And what to do? Well, they petitioned the owner, and he eventually wrote back and he said, economics requires us to hire the cheapest help. Well, a group of men, that's when the labor union was founded actually, a group of men went off into what we call Bidwell Park and met in the night and decided they had to be violent in order to get rid of this Chinese labor problem. Now, my interest is also how the Chinese responded to this. It is hard to trace because no one communicated, with the Chinese to put on the record their meetings, so we can only judge what they thought by what they did, which is where my report here comes from. And that a lot of what they did was apparent. They were victims, yes. But what also interested me is that they were not passive. They saw what was happening, they thought about it, they had to work it out, they had to figure what to do, who would do what talents they brought to bear. Some just couldn't deal with the whole problem, and they left. We might be interested to know that one place they would go for peace and security was Vina. At Vina, there was a large Chinese community working on farms, and so some of ours went there. Some, of course, went back to the cities, but most did stay. They had work here, their employers appreciated them, and they hoped it could all be worked out. Therefore, those who stayed had to figure out how to stand up to their adversaries, how to deal with the situation, hoping it would pass, if people could be made to see what was happening and if they could get the town to act on it. Again, one of the problems was that the government of Chico was anti-Chinese. And so the town officials, the town marshal, that is the police chief, was anti-Chinese. And one we had that was actually quite a fine man and wasn't anti-Chinese, but succumbed to the pressure of so much anti-Chinese around him. So he was a kind of a complex person. In any case, most of the Chinese stood up to their adversary as best they could. They knew they were outnumbered, they were outgunned, and they were surrounded. So they didn't have a lot of options. in their temple, furnished with the beautiful items that you're looking at here today. Their leaders met, and we don't know who those leaders were, but they strategized, they agreed on tactics, and they assigned roles. For example, the Chinese living this way and during this period in the 1870s created what we call New Chinatown over on Orange Street along the railroad tracks. And under that, there were secret rooms. And that's where, you know, Chinese could hide, or visiting Chinese could stay, or whatever they needed it for. However, that's where a young Chinese boy who was 16, who had murdered the housewife who had reared him and whom he helped, he murdered her in Glenn County. There's a whole chapter on that murder, and it's a fascinating case because he had his reasons, and they emerged very late in a whole pattern. But there was just a huge uproar, of course, over this murder. And he escaped. And it turned out that they hid him here below the Chinatown for a time. But at some point, there was such a horrible thing going on that they were endangered by hiding him. So they forced him to leave. So he had to go find another place. They also had another asset that they used as best they could, and that is that there was a superb man in Chico at that time. He was Constable Ben True. It's an irony that Ben True is kind of a hero, and one of the people who killed Chinese was the Slaughter brothers. It would be a bad novel that would use those. In any case, those were true. In any case, Constable Ben True was the constable or policeman for the Chinatowns. And he treated them with a lot of respect. He got to know them as individuals. At noon, they had time off. This was understood that they had time off at noon. They would get together and play mahjong or something. And he would stop by and he learned their games really well. He would point out different moves they could make. They were comfortable with him. He, when they had a problem negotiating work contract with a farmer or another employer, he would sort of help to get them a little bit better deal on the labor cost. When they had other problems, he would do what he could for them, and they were very grateful. For his work with the Chinese, by the way, the anti-Chinese in town tried to ruin him. He was subject to incredible pressures, and he was much more worthy than the treatment he found. Although employers, of course, respected True, neither they nor he could resolve this problem of the resentment. The Chinese leaders were shrewd and intelligent, but they were on the defensive, and they had to look to themselves. Although in no position for outright confrontation, they vacuumed up information. Chinese were all over town. They were ordinarily discreet people. They talked among themselves. They didn't really socialize with whites. But they became spies. So that was the role of the ordinary Chinese, to find everything out they could about what was going on so that they could develop defensive strategies as best possible. They worked, in homes, cafes, they were in bars. Whites were so used to having Chinese everywhere around them that they just talked in front of them, not thinking that the Chinese knew what they were saying. It was as if they were so ubiquitous they couldn't be seen. People didn't realize kind of they were there when they were quite there. Whites overlooked, didn't grasp that Chinese understood English. And so they couldn't really be secret in talking in front of them. So they would be listening often steps away, carrying a serving tray, sweeping a floor, cleaning a table, standing behind a door, gardening under a window that was open. Therefore, while these significant fires I referred to earlier did have terrible consequences, when the Chinese did have tips that something was going to happen and where, they made ready for it. What they would do is clear the target buildings. They would fill them with buckets of water, and they would put watchmen in. They would see the arsonist come and spread out the hay and pour coal oil on it and light it, and then they would run off. At that point, the Chinese would rush out, douse the straw with water, and they saved, a number of buildings that way. So their defense was pretty satisfying from time to time. In the old Chinatown, which was located across Bloom Street from where the black section was, the two peoples that I could ever identify didn't seem to interact socially, but they were both people who understood that they were at risk to some some white men. There were a lot of Southerners in Chico. About 40% of Chico was Southern during the Civil War, and there was an overlap because many Southerners came here after the Civil War, and they brought those ideas. So when arsonists would attack the Chinese in old Chinatown, the blacks would rally and help them put out fires. So they had some allies in that regard. There was certainly planning of other kinds. For example, no Chinese used, let alone owned, pistols. Their weapon of choice, they killed one another with very serious knives they carried or kept at hand. At one point, therefore, the Chinese went to the Stilson hardware store on Main at 2nd, and they bought up all of the pistols and all of the ammunition. And then they made sure that they would be seen using this, so they did target practice along the railroad tracks near Orange Street. And whites were quite fascinated to think the Chinese are out there armed and getting pretty good at it pretty fast. I never saw any evidence that they actually used the guns, but it was, I thought, a fairly shrewd move. In another instance, and this might be in one of the pictures up here, I think. One of the pictures shows a line of Chinese walking up 2nd Street, and there's not anybody around. I think that might be what I'm describing here. They all gathered at the temple, all of them. spoke up and said that that was not acceptable. They were not going to do that. And so it continued. There's a remnant of the bad feeling well into the 1890s. Yes.
Did they ever build anything in town? I remember being over across from the Methodist Church, that block, they seemed to be a lot of them there. Did they build anything, or just other people let them use their buildings?
Well, apparently they built, I just am assuming they built those buildings. It could be that somebody else owned them, but the impression was that those were that was their property. That's a good question. It's never come up. I've never thought to look at that. I've gone through a lot of deeds. Do you know?
Well, I'm not 100% positive, but a man named Randall Rice built a lot of the buildings on that street.
Okay.
And he was white, okay.
All right. So he might have leased them to them or something.
And maybe even the Walker brothers built some of them because there were brick buildings on that street.
Yeah.
Jefferson and somebody other, Walker, had brick building, brick making enterprises. And those may have gone in because one of the Walkers owned the side of Chinatown where the Methodist Church is.
Oh, well, that sounds like, the answer is that there's the Walkers who had a brick company and Rice people probably might have built those buildings. That makes sense, but I don't know. Okay. Yes. Back there. Go ahead.
I was just wondering if you knew anything about what the schooling was like for the children of the Chinese, if they were teaching them at home or if they established schools or anything like that for them in the community.
Well, for one thing, there were very few women here. There were women brought in for sex, and they were kind of kept in back rooms, at least in this early period. Over time, that changed and normalized to some degree. But I don't recall any reference. There, John, you?
In one of the Sanborn Fire Insurance maps, I believe it was 1885, where pulling Cyclery is now at 8th and Main. It's not the same building, I don't believe, as is there now.
Yeah.
But there was two adjoining buildings, and one is marked a Chinese school, and the other one is a Chinese shirt factory.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, I had never heard of that. That's great. So there were Chinese children then later. Okay. Anything else? Well, thank you. There's a lot the whole population. They gathered at the temple near the tracks, walked up 5th Street, turned onto Main and turned north. And then the major business street in Chico in those days was 2nd. So they turned down 2nd, and all they did was walk, all of them, very soberly, very seriously, down 2nd Street and just walked around and then ended up at the Flume Old Chinatown. There was nobody who came out to watch. Other Chinese parades were colorful and people did enjoy the exotic side of them in the various celebrations. But this one was not that kind of walk. And people did watch from the windows and offices upstairs and balconies. After, I mentioned earlier, the attacks on Chinese, and I mentioned the one which led to the formation of the violent group, the labor union. I would like to mention here again about that. that in response to this company coming, 6 of the people from that violent group did go east of Chico to the Lem Ranch. Many of you have heard of that incident. They had a party of 6 Chinese clearing brush there. The men walked into this shack that the Chinese had created. They finished their work for the day, and some had already fallen asleep. Others were talking about how much more work there'd be before their contract was done. And the 6 men from Chico burst into the shack, and each one was to kill a Chinese. And there were 6 Chinese in there. All of them were shot. 4 died immediately. 1 crawled off in terrible condition and could not move. Another had been shot in the arm and pretended to be dead. And he made it to the family ranch house. And the family was terrified themselves. So they did wrap up his arm, but they didn't go for help. But he made it into town and went, and he tried to get help. You see, it was outside the city limits. And so the local sheriff, the local police chief wouldn't go out there. So he had to get the supervisor. Well, this night, the supervisor didn't want to go out there at night. So nobody went out there except Ben True. So Ben True tried to do what he could on his own. Anyway, it was a terrible situation. And once again, bad as it was, even though the town stood on the street and watched wagons of the bodies be brought in to the morgue, behind the morgue was the basement of the, I think it was the basement of the Moorhead building at 3rd and Broadway. Everybody watched the bodies come in, but there was no investigation. Nothing was going to happen. Chinese noted this. This time they weren't going to take that. So they sent emissaries to San Francisco, and the 6 companies there raised $1,500 to send up 2 detectives. In Chico, the pro-Chinese businessmen were appalled that there was no investigation, no prosecution, nothing. So Gus Chapman was the leader of this. He founded and organized a vigilante group to act in place of the government. And so they hired a former sheriff who was willing to do the job, and he set out to find out who had done this. It wasn't really that hard to find out. In a town of 4,000 where everybody drank a lot, there was a lot of information floating around. So in any case, these men are all collected. I would mention too, in this occasion, the Chinese did have access to a lawyer who was a formidable lawyer once activated, and he did have something to do with pursuing this once the vigilante group got organized. That was Frank Luss. His home was that building across the street today.
Madison Dairy.
But at this time, his office was where the Crush restaurant is. So when you're having dinner at Crush, just look around. That was where Frank Luss worked for the Chinese. And he would investigate if a Chinese there was a case where a Chinese was murdered by 2 white settler miners on View Creek. And that one was prosecuted, and he did bring that about. The murders were prosecuted eventually. They were sentenced, but after 5 years, when an Oroville man became governor, they were all pardoned. All right. Through the 1890s, there were other substantial incidents that I think you'd be kind of interested to know about. But for today, I hope I've conveyed that when terrible things happened to the Chinese were people of intelligence and courage. They did stand up for themselves as best they could in an impossible situation. They made a substantive defense. Today, Chico has no descendants from those 19th century Chinese. Why? Well, they did leave. In 1888, a lawyer from the 6 companies came up and had them meet in the temple. And he announced to them that the 6 companies had had a discussion about Chico. And they had decided that Chico was hopeless. And they wanted them all to leave. And so they did. They went to Sacramento and San Francisco to find jobs where they would be secure. There were a few who stayed. They were mostly elders who did have work. They didn't know anybody in those other towns. And so they did stay. And some of them lived into the early 20th century. And there are some Chinese graves that you can see in the Chico Cemetery, right along the fence in particular, the oldest ones. An interesting part of that cemetery. The cemetery is a treasure we have, in my opinion. There are two Chinese families who've been here over 100 years. Those are the Hom, H-O-M, and Lee, L-E-E families. They came in the 1890s and stayed in, there's an article, I did a chapter on them also. They had a challenging experience, nothing like the others, of course, but they handled it. Some of them served in World War II. I've had the privilege of meeting them and enjoying them. So I don't know if there are Lees and Homs still. I think the elders are now gone. Well, the Chinese experience in Chico is solely represented in Chico, as far as I know, by the temple. And so I think we're all very grateful for the privilege of having these beautiful remnants of their experience here. Do you have any questions? Yes.
So how many Chinese were there when there were 4,000 people in Chico?
I never actually made a count. One could probably from censuses, and I probably should have. But I would say it was probably at least 15% of the population. It was enough to be noticeable, obviously. But I don't have any figures or true percentage, that's just a guess.
Michele,
Yes.
my grandfather was J.J. Moorhead.
Oh, okay.
When he'd leave to go out of town, Wang Yi would take over and manage the ranch, and he was also the bookkeeper for a while.
You did
Until
everything.
my grandfather hired Rory Newell, but he was the #1 man, even though he did all the cooking and everything else, but yet
He had everything.
there's an example of where a family really trusted in, this person was basically part family, even though he was an employee.
Yeah, that's the impression I got from Dorothy
Yeah.
too. And it's kind of a consolation, you know, as a Chicoan, that some of them had very good experiences like that.
Well, it's also, J.J. Moorhead also, when they're taking all the Indians and gathering them out, he did not allow the Maidu on his property to be taken, and they were camped out along
Is that right? Oh,
Big
that-
Chico Creek.
Yeah,
So
I'm
it's
glad to
nice to
hear
know this family history that
it
they
is.
respected all these other people.
That's right. I'm glad, I didn't know that.
Michelle, we had trouble hearing what he said in the back. Could you repeat it for us? What did he say?
He was saying that he is a member of the Moorhead family,
Uh-huh.
and he was explaining the depth and breadth of the services that their principal Chinese servant did for the family, and he said that also they were protective of the Mechuta in that area. Yeah, thank you. I forgot that you can't hear back there. Are there other questions? I'll repeat them. Yes.
Forgot already.
That's all right. I do that all the time. That's really terrible.
Oh, I know.
Okay.
When they were getting Chinese to ship over here,
Yeah.
were these volunteers or were they just rounded up African?
No, most of them were volunteers. It was considered an important opportunity. And I've never heard of them being just grabbed and put on ships.
Michelle?
Yes.
Were the Chinese granted citizenship?
Were the Chinese granted citizenship? No, in fact, there was a law passed that they were not to be able to come in.
Did
I think-
show you that?
Yeah. I don't know though, I'm just guessing. There was so much hostility, but that wasn't so true in the East, where the laws were made, the federal laws, so that's why I'm not certain on that count. Yes.
Were there ever Japanese that came over to work?
Were there ever Japanese that came over to work? Yes. And there were some who owned land in this area. When they were taken up to, during World War II, there were families here who actually protected their land and restored it. And I think at least one or more who didn't restore it to them. So it wasn't as drastic a situation.
Now, did the Chinese also built the walls, I guess?
The Chinese built the walls. No, actually, I think the best information is that it was Portuguese. We had a lot of Portuguese come here. I'm not certain exactly when that took place, but the house I bought, the Little Chapman Mansion, I bought from a man who was of Portuguese heritage. And he said his father remembered being on fishing ships, chasing, I don't know, some kind of fish, off of Portugal. It was kind of a dramatic story. I'm sorry I can't do credit to it, because I was fascinated by it. But there were a lot of Portuguese. But also, people in the East also had a lot of rocks on their land. So it was kind of a natural thing to pile them, make something of them, to clear them for crops. So I don't think we can attribute all that to the Chinese. Yes.
What was Bidwell's relationship with the Chinese? I know they protected the Indians.
What was Bidwell's relationship to the Chinese? He hired Chinese. He said he didn't. He said he didn't to the press when the press was covering the Lem Ranch business. But actually he did hire Chinese, and I don't think that there was ever an issue that he had with Chinese. He valued them a lot. They made a big contribution to his ranch because they were very capable people. They were smart, and many of them had agricultural experience in China, so they actually brought ideas. And Bidwell he had a terrible time with the anti-Chinese. As I said, they burned down buildings, and he was so angry about, them and not trusting them, of course, that he fired people on his staff who were anti-Chinese, if he found out. And that created bitterness against him, that good white workers were being fired to protect Chinese. You can see how people think when they get kind of crazy. Anyway, other questions? John?
Yes, we read that at one time the Chinese could not own property in Chico, but they could own the building that was on it. Is that what you believe?
I've never seen that. I never saw that. That reminds me of something though. In the 1890s, after there was another bunch of burning down of Chinese buildings. And so there was a problem if they could stay at all in town, they had to live somewhere. And so nobody wanted them back in town. And so they only agreed to have them be able to rebuild if they built out in the country, which meant they had to commute, basically. And they actually spoke